As we celebrate the Feast of the Ascension, sometimes I think we would like to skip this feast and move to Pentecost. And yet Jesus said to the disciples, why are you, the angel said to the prophet, why are you staring at the sky? It's as if the disciples were in a liminal space, a middle of a rite of passage, a transition stage. Think about all that they had already passed through: the death, the loss, the grief, the resurrection. And this liminal space, as Jesus goes to the Father, can be disorienting. A liminal time is defined as a time in between, a time of transition and change. Sister Diane Burgard says the apostles, this liminal time, a time in between, this transition, that they are trying to cling to what they have known while realizing that things are no longer what they were before. We need this intermediate stage, this transition stage of ascension before Pentecost. It is a preparation stage. And I think it's frustrating to us at times because we're impatient. But the feast tells us not to simply stare at the sky like the first apostles, but to wait in expectation for what's next. This liminal space, this transitional stage, the earth has so much, creation has so much to teach us. And I think of a butterfly. It's a caterpillar, and then there's the intermediate stage of the cocoon before it's released as a butterfly. But we can't skip that transitional, that preparation stage. And if we try to force it, it doesn't work. We have to wait for what is developing, what is moving, how we're moving in this transitional stage. I think the reality is many times we want to move past something, but reality is we have to move through it. Parents get this. The art of parenting. A lot of times our parents have to allow their children to go through, to experience certain things, even though they have the resolution, so that they can move into that new reality. Sometimes in pastoral counseling, as I listen, as I'm working with someone, I watch that in that liminal space, that intermediate stage, that aha, where the person is released. We're impatient. We often like to fix that. Teilhard de Chardin quotes that we are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We would like to skip this intermediate stage. We are impatient on being on the way to something unknown and new. I would suggest that this intermediate stage, this liminal stage, this middle ground to something new, COVID has been that for us. Remember, last year, everything stopped. We couldn't just go forward. And the reality in this stage is there's been a lot of suffering and death. How has that pain affected and changed us? But also, how are we different through this liminal stage? What is coming to birth in us? What is developing? And how are we seeing reality around us different? There are so many things that we could reflect on, that we must look at our own lives. But have we learned to live more sustainable? Do we have a more concern for those that are vulnerable around us? The COVID experts tell me that the shot is the only way that we move through this liminal stage to something new. And the encouragement that if we're able to get that shot. But maybe that was part of a liminal stage. Maybe you experienced that release when you received that shot, that maybe we could begin to move to something new. And that's what this stage is about. That maybe St. Agnes can explain this liminal space for us. Our church is shaped in what is known an almond shape of a mandorla. And it's supposed to be the interaction of human and divine. That we actually stand in this liminal space to move towards a new reality. And if we look at the prophets throughout history, they stood in that liminal space and saw into a new reality. The reality of not what the world is, but what it could be. The reign of God. A world of equality, peace, love, justice. And they gave their lives for that. And Jesus wasn't the first today. Remember, we see these two figures, Elijah and Elisha, that are there at the ascension. Remember, Elijah, when he went up in a chariot, he gave Elisha a double portion of his spirit. And that Jesus, as he ascends to the Father, he is going to pass on his spirit to his disciples. If you've ever lost someone you love, maybe you've had the experience of this spirit that's passed on. The spirit, the prophetic spirit in work in them, the prophetic spirit of Jesus. I can't help but think of Bishop Oscar Romero, who was murdered at the altar. He gave up his life standing for the people of El Salvador on the margins. And he said, if they kill me, I will be raised up in the El Salvadorian people. That liminal space, that reign of God that he worked for, that spirit that worked through him was passed on to the people we loved. And I'd like to speak to the people of Appalachia today. If you were a part of our event with Bishop John Stowe that we did on Appalachia with Michael Eifright, our good friend of our diocese, who stood up for injustice, who stood for the underprivileged, who raised up the voice of the marginalized among Appalachia, the voice that gets pushed to the periphery. And Bishop Stowe said, Mike Eifright has a prophetic legacy. Mike Eifright has recently passed from this life, departed. He's went to the Lord. But to the people of Appalachia out there, he passes on his prophetic spirit to us, calls us to carry on that mission to raise up the voice on the periphery. And maybe you have those in your life, those that gather around us at this altar. Mike would call it their dangerous memories. And we don't put halos on them, but they suffered to bring about that reign of God, to live within that liminal space, to be empowered again and again by the gift of the Spirit. I would suggest that as a church, we live in a liminal space. We live between ascension. Jesus is at the right hand of the Father in Pentecost. And we're called to wait in expectation that just like those who have went before us, the prophetic spirit has been passed on to them, that it will be passed on to us. And we will be sent to carry out that mission of Jesus. And the signs will accompany us. The signs of new life of the Spirit, that new world coming about. The prophets didn't lose their expectancy. And I go back to Teilhard de Chardin, who was also a prophet that suffered so much that he wouldn't stand for the church and world that is, but stood for the world and church that would be. And he says that as we gather around this altar, let's have an expectancy for that Spirit to send us forth. Taylor says, successors of Israel, we Christians have been charged with keeping the flame of desire alive in the world. Only 20 centuries have passed since the ascension. What have we made of our expectancy? We persist saying that we keep vigil in expectation of the Master. But reality, we would have to admit, if we were sincere, that we no longer expect anything. The flame must be revived at all cost. As we gather at this table, may the flame in us be revived at all costs.